Sometimes it's the storm surge, other times wind and rain.
The wind is whipping me in the face.
And sometimes tornadoes.
There we have the tornado live on the air right now over Myrtle Beach.
The Grand Strand and PD are no stranger to hurricanes and the impacts that come with these storms. Every town, city, and county are at risk, forced to not only brace for what could happen, but to know what to do when the next storm blows in. And every year, we prepare, we recover, and we learn, but we never forget.
Live, local, now. This is a WMBF First Alert Hurricane Special.
Every hurricane season, Myrtle Beach finds itself on the front lines. With storm surge, hurricane force winds, and flooding rains, hurricanes have literally redefined the city skyline, how we respond to major disasters, and how we move forward.
We had an idea something was going on. We turned the radio on, that's when.
The latest report, the hurricane moving north.
Hurricane Hazel slammed into the Grand Strand in 1954, making landfall that October near Little River as a Category 4 hurricane. The storm's 16-foot storm surge demolished every pier and nearly every beachfront home along the 170-mile stretch between Myrtle Beach and Wilmington.
They were just toppled over, and one of them, the whole front of it was gone.
The destruction opened the door for developers to rebuild, transforming Myrtle Beach into a major tourist destination. But the clock was ticking for those hotels and beachfront homes. Hurricane Hugo damaged or destroyed around 80,000 of them along the South Carolina coast when it made landfall near Charleston in September 1989. Neighbors who lived here at the time say hurricanes never intimidated them until Hugo.
The fireman came to the door and he said, "We're asking everybody to leave." And I said, "Oh, we aren't scared." I said, "We've sat through a lot of these." And he said, "Well, ma'am, how many people live in this house? So we'll know how many bodies to look for."
Hugo's historic surge and battering waves reduced the spring-made pier to just 150 feet, destroyed 2 others, and left feet of sand on Ocean Boulevard.
Fast forward 10 years. Hurricane Floyd avoided a direct hit on South Carolina, but a landfall near Wilmington was close enough for record-breaking rainfall. That led to widespread flash flooding and pushed the Waccamaw River to record heights.
This is really a serious storm. We need to get you out of there. I am begging you at this point.
A quiet period after Floyd came crashing to an end when Matthew struck in 2016. Every coastal county in the state had evacuation orders leading up to the storm, which made landfall in October 2016 near McClellanville. It then crossed directly over Myrtle Beach just a few hours later.
It has been one of those iconic landmarks from the early days when Broadway at the Beach was built.
Matthew ripped a hole in the city's iconic Palace Theater, which later met a wrecking ball when the owners decided the damage was just too expensive to fix. Matthew also marked the city of Myrtle Beach's second highest storm surge on record, behind Hugo. Just 2 years later, Hurricane Florence, a slow-motion flooding disaster. 15 to 30 inches of rain fell over a few days while tornadoes touched down.
I do believe we're looking at what is the tornado now, working its way. It's going to be crossing over Highway 17. All right, it's going to be crossing over Highway 17, very, very close to Broadway at the Beach.
Florence also marked the very first time the state ordered all 3 Grand Strand evacuation zones to leave, resulting in a ghost town across the beaches.
This was a mistake. Definitely paying for it now. It was just kind of crazy. It's just kind of overwhelming.
The city of Myrtle Beach made national headlines a year later in 2019 when we spotted the famous red Jeep abandoned on the sand in the middle of Hurricane Dorian. Waves pulled the car closer and closer to the ocean, and we later learned the cousin of the car's owner drove it out to get a few pictures of the sunrise.
And I guess there's that runoff there, and he didn't realize it was in front of him. He was looking out the window and he went off and got stuck.
Despite waves battering the now famous red Jeep for hours, incredibly, the battery still worked and crews could tow it away.
We now officially have landfall. Hurricane Ian has made landfall basically in Georgetown County.
And then Hurricane Ian. Monster waves battered the city's protective sand dunes and damaged several landmarks, including the 2nd Avenue and Apache Piers in Myrtle Beach. The surge pushed inland in some parts of the city, with Pirate Land Campground and Family Kingdom Amusement Park underwater. Near hurricane-force gusts also ripped pieces of metal, siding, and roofs off of buildings, sending debris flying through downtown. When the sun finally started peeking out, Myrtle Beach's newest and unattended attraction was sitting on the beach. Ian's waves pushed a large shrimp boat ashore, creating a sight to see for curious residents hoping to check out the post-hurricane beaches. Myrtle Beach police guarded the Shana Michelle until crews were able to dig a trench so 2 other boats could pull it back out to sea.
We can typically count on storm surge and wind being the biggest threat in Myrtle Beach when a hurricane is churning offshore.
We see the same thing down in the South Strand with Hugo, Matthew, and Ian, to name a few, writing their names down in the history books. It's the stories of devastation and recovery many in this area would like to forget.
Hurricane Hugo's massive storm surge in Garden City wiped out 90% of homes and undermined beachfront hotels and condos. The storm surge was also devastating in Surfside Beach, covering Ocean Boulevard with feet of sand and tossing entire houses into the street. To put that into perspective, Hugo's 16-foot storm surge towers over anything we've seen in recent years, including Matthew's surge in 2016, followed by Ian in 2022 and Isaias in 2020. In Pawleys Island, Hugo's surge cut the island in 2, carving out the 20-foot wide inlet we know today. And just down the road, Hugo devastated Georgetown and destroyed marinas in the area. Wind and falling trees also damaged or destroyed hundreds of homes with wind gusts over 108 miles per hour.
Hugo's damage reshaped the South Strand, but it doesn't take a Category 4 to bring major impacts.
Hurricane Joaquin never made landfall in the U.S., but still led to historic flooding in October 2015, pouring 12 to 18 inches of rain across the South Strand.
And I just distinctly remember Marla saying, it's gone. The Surfside Pier is gone. And that was a really sad moment in the coverage, but also a moment of, okay, this is really a serious storm.
Just 1 year later, Hurricane Matthew wreaked havoc. Its storm surge, paired with heavy rain and hurricane-force winds, tore apart one of our area's best-known landmarks, the Surfside Beach Pier. 6 years later, the pier is still being rebuilt, but is being made of concrete and raised 10 feet higher than the old pier to prevent similar damage from future storms.
Whether we're anticipating a Category 4 hurricane like Hugo or a 1 like Ian or Matthew, storm surge is always a major concern. We study previous storms and previous tracks to help you prepare, but it's important to remember every storm is different.
For example, Hurricane Dorian in 2019 left the Murrells Inlet Marsh Walk underwater, but places that usually get hit hard, like Surfside Beach and Garden City, only saw minor beach erosion. That area saw another break in 2021, but Hurricane Ian roared ashore into the South Strand in 2022. In Pawleys Island, crews closed the causeways hour before Ian made landfall near neighboring Georgetown. Winyah Bay recorded the highest wind gusts of 84 miles per hour. Storm surge washed dunes and multiple feet of sand into the streets of Garden City. It prevented people from leaving their homes by car and became a major problem as the storm made its way out when a fire broke out 3 miles down Waccamaw Drive. The flooded and sand-covered roadways made it nearly impossible for already exhausted firefighters to get to the 3 burning homes. And once they did, fire crews had very little water pressure due to damaged water lines. Waccamaw Drive remained closed for days, and once the flooding receded, you can see here, those water levels nearly doubled what we saw just 6 years earlier with Matthew.
It's the low elevation and intricate coastline of the South Strand that puts this area in so much danger.
But across our inland areas, hurricanes can be just as devastating, bringing deadly consequences dozens and even hundreds of miles away from the coast.
We just feel sorry for everybody.
Inland Horry County has taken a beating in recent years, most notably in 2018 when Hurricane Florence flooded entire towns and even prompted a visit from former President Donald Trump. The then Commander-in-Chief took a stroll with Governor Henry McMaster in Conway, where the Waccamaw River surged past its previous record by 4 feet, leaving thousands of folks homeless, closing major roads, and disrupting life for weeks.
Your home's your safe haven. It's your comfort zone, and just the fear of the unknown of if you're going to have a home to come back to or what it's going to be when you can come back.
The hurricane equally devastated Nichols, Mullins, and Bucksport, with some homes taking on as much as 8 feet of water. Florence completely isolated many communities for almost 10 days. Raw sewage flooded from the Conway wastewater plant into a nearby tributary.
How do you feel about this traffic, Linda?
I don't like it at all. I've been in it for about an hour and a half.
Floodwaters nearly cut off the Grand Strand from the rest of the state as a rising Waccamaw River squeezed 501 to just 1 lane in and 1 lane out.
Hurricane Florence marked a scary and all too familiar experience for residents of central Horry County, coming just 2 years after the flooding from Matthew.
Another slow-moving disaster. Hurricane Matthew caused the Waccamaw River to rise, leaving parts of Conway and Soxie underwater more than a week after the storm had already passed. Matthew's flooding and winds damaged nearly 200 homes and businesses in Conway. At the time, many compared it to Hurricane Floyd and Hugo, with no way of knowing Florence was only 2 years away.
The storm's impacts stretch all the way to the present day as state and county officials continue to debate building a safer and more efficient way out of the Grand Strand.
The North Strand, from North Myrtle Beach to Cherry Grove to Little River. A beautiful part of our community, but one that is highly susceptible to storm surge, something we've seen over and over again the past few years.
Matthew's surge in 2016 washed away dunes and flooded large portions of the North Strand. Water became so deep and dangerous, emergency responders could not reach most of the area during the height of the storm.
The storm surge has cut off emergency response in Cherry Grove. There is no more emergency rescue in Cherry Grove because of the storm surge.
That storm surge became even more dangerous when it flooded electrical equipment, sparking a massive fire in Cherry Grove. Those flames, driven by the strong winds, spread to 5 buildings, causing millions of dollars in damage. Isaias in 2020 brought more high water to the area as it made landfall just across the border. Again, the surge brought the biggest impacts, destroying the Sea Cabin Pier and flooding roads. High water throughout Cherry Grove destroyed and dislodged many of the piers and docks along the canals and left hundreds of cars underwater. And then, in 2022, Hurricane Ian brought not only surge but towering waves. This time, too much for the beloved Cherry Grove Pier.
So why is the North Strand so vulnerable to these storms? The first reason? Elevation.
Areas from Little River Inlet through the canals of Cherry Grove and down to North Myrtle Beach only average 2 to 5 feet above sea level. Another factor putting this area in the storm surge danger zone is the complicated nature of the landscape. Rising surge can push into the Little River Inlet and Hog Inlet, as well as the complex network of creeks, marshes, and swashes. The shape of the coast also plays a major role in funneling in storm surge. The concave shape of the Grand Strand allows water to naturally start to pile up and push in with strong onshore winds. This is why most of the area is in Evacuation Zone A, encompassing all areas east of Highway 17 Business and Bypass Junction all the way to the state line.
If you're a resident of the North Strand, it's vitally important to know your risk and know your zone. Evacuations are the #1 part of your preparedness plan. In an area where most roads flood during a hurricane, you have to consider, by not evacuating, you may be stuck without water, without power, and without access to emergency service.
Obviously, inland areas are safe from storm surge produced by hurricanes, but there are other threats that are just as important. In fact, inlet flooding is the #1 cause of death in hurricanes.
And we've seen it happen over the past few years. Matthew led to record-breaking flooding in 2016, causing record-high river levels, bursting dams, and flooding entire towns.
And I remembered one of my parishioners' phone numbers. And my wife's phone picked up just long enough for me to call him and say, Ronnie, this is Eddie. We're underwater. We need help. And then the phone quit working.
The rising water swallowed Nichols, forcing the National Guard to rescue nearly 150 people from their homes. Floodwaters damaged nearly 400 houses, all 4 area churches, and dozens of businesses.
It's a nightmare going through it 2 times in 2 years.
The small town met a similar fate just 2 years later with Hurricane Florence. The storm damaged almost every home rebuilt after Matthew. Even further inland, the rising water from the Lumber River shut down a 33-mile stretch of Interstate 95.
But it's not just water those of you in the PD need to be concerned with. Inland areas are also prone to damaging hurricane winds.
Obviously, you can see here the damage and just how serious this is. We are near downtown Florence right now. And once again, within the past 20 minutes, this gas station has completely collapsed.
Wind damage can lead to widespread power outages and uproot trees, making roads impassable. We saw it with Matthew in 2016 with hurricane-force gusts reported in most of the area. It's also common for hurricanes to spin up tornadoes. These tornadoes often form in rain bands well away from the center of the storm.
When preparing for hurricane season inlet, the focus needs to be on sheltering in place. This means renting your home, hurricane kit, and being prepared to ride out a storm. Evacuations are not necessary unless you live in an area prone to flooding.
It's important to remember that it only takes one hurricane to make this a bad season, but it's also important to understand what kind of season we may be in for.
The outlooks for this season have a common theme: conflicting signals. A developing El Nino may tend to suppress developing storms. El Nino, which is the warming of the water of the eastern Pacific Ocean, tends to alter wind patterns over the Atlantic that leads to more wind shear. That wind shear works to keep as many storms from forming. Countering El Nino this season is the very warm water in the Atlantic. Water temperatures are above normal in much of the Atlantic, especially in the common formation areas for tropical storms and hurricanes. This warmer than normal water could help to fuel additional storms.
Back in April, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Phil Klotzbach from Colorado State University about how these factors may come into play this hurricane season.
Now, obviously, the hurricane season starts in June, but really the meat of it still August, September, October. What are you going to be looking at between now and then to maybe fine-tune that forecast as we head forward?
Yeah, so we're going to be focusing a lot on basically what's the forcing for this El Nino. Do we get the wind patterns that we need to really amp this El Nino up? We'll also be monitoring what's going on in the Atlantic, in addition to the water temperatures. What are the pressures like? Are they falling? Are they lower than normal? What's the wind starting to look like too? We can start to look at like wind shear in June and July, and that's a pretty good predictor for what happens during the peak months of the season.
Right, and as we always say, it always takes one, so not necessarily to focus on the numbers, but one of the things I thought was pretty interesting from your presentation and your forecast release were the landfall probabilities for different parts of the coast. And even with a slightly below normal season as far as South Carolina goes, the landfall, or at least passing within 50 miles of South Carolina, it's still a 1 in 3 chance.
So you can't obviously say months in advance where a storm is going to go, but you can calculate historically what the odds are, and then you can basically look and say, okay, and so we basically adjust those probabilities up or down based on our forecast. So busier seasons tend to have more landfalls. So yeah, on average, it's about a 1 in 3 chance that a storm passes within 50 miles of South Carolina.
These forecasts will be fine-tuned as the season wears on, depending on how strong El Nino becomes. But it's very important to remember that even in the slowest hurricane season, strong storms can roar ashore. But as the team with the most combined years of experience in the area, we will give you the first alert to hurricane season 2023. Be safe and be prepared.